Three Houses of the Edain. Origins. The details regarding the origin of men are described throughout a number of Tolkien's works, largely in the Silmarillion, where their awakening and migrations began in the First Age. They came to being shortly after the Siege of Angband, or the Long Peace began, First Age 260. They were the second-born children of Ilúvatar, after the Elves, and were thus referred to as many names in reference to that status. The Second People, or the Atani in Quenya, and the Afterborn, or the Apanonar, the Followers, or the Hildur, and many more. Men awoke in Hildorien, in the far eastern lands of Middle-earth. They bore what was referred to as the gift of men, a mortal life. Whereas the elves' spirits were bound to the world and its timeline, being sent to the halls of Mandos to await their judgment or the ending of the world, the fate of men is far less distinguished after death. However, it is said that when the time came, Eru intended for men to participate in a second music for the Ainur. Morgoth's influence eventually reached the race of awakened men in the absence of the Valar and the Elves, and they grew corrupted by his instilling in them a fear of death. What was intended as a gift had then become their doom. They grew corrupt, as well as distant and even mistrustful from what it was the Valar might have offered in Morgoth's place. But from early on, they were a largely fractured race, more so than the elves or the dwarves, who viewed the race with mixed emotions. As fate would have it, several tribes managed to escape the grip of Morgoth's influence, fleeing westward toward the setting sun. After a time, men journeyed beyond their birthplace, meeting both dwarves and Avari, the wanderers, or elves who had not made the initial journey west, which would influence the development of their own cultures and languages. They would eventually cross the Blue Mountains and travel to the lands of Beleriand. The tribes of men that made this migration eventually came to be known as the Three Houses of Edain. They would give rise to some of the greatest heroes in the Tolkien Legendarium. House of Bëor. The first of these houses to reach Beleriand, in the year First Age 310, was the House of Bëor. Bëor himself, originally named Balan, was born in First Age 262 and lived long enough to die of old age, something the elves had yet to witness. But his fate was rare among the men of the West, as many would die tragic deaths in the wars against Morgoth and the conflicts amongst elves, men, and orcs. The Bëorians were largely dark-haired, dark-eyed, and stout in stature, but there were some among them who stood taller and wore lighter shades of hair. They are said to have most resembled the Noldor. They were a remarkable people, fast learning and capable of enduring the longest hardships, as tales to come would no doubt give explanation. The people of the House of Bëor were first discovered by Finrod Filagund, Lord of Nargothrond, son of Finarfin, and brother of Galadriel, after he happened upon them sleeping in Osiriand. This was the first meeting of men with the Eldar. They awoke to his music and formed a strong bond, and with Finrod's favour, Thingol was convinced to allow them lands in the realm of Feanor's youngest sons, Amrod and Amras. It was during their time in this land, now known as Estelad, the encampment, that any men first joined the High Elves in battle for their skirmishes with Morgoth's forces. This would not be their last bout with evil, of course. Years later, under the lordship of Beor's great-grandson, Boromir, they were granted a home within Landros, in Dorthonion. In 455, Morgoth overtook these lands in the Dagor Bragolach, leading to the deaths of several leaders of the Bëorians, including Boromir's own grandson, Bregolas. His brother, Barahir, would carry the torch after the devastation. Barahir, after saving Finrod's life in the Dagor Bragolach, was gifted a ring. The ring, referred to as the Ring of Barahir, would be passed down for many generations, including to Aragorn Elessar. Barahir sent his people forth to Brethil and Orlomin, while he remained with his son, Beren, his nephews, Baragund and Belegund, and several others, in Dorthonion. Sadly, one of these remaining men would betray the others, giving up their position to Sauron in his pursuit, which led to their decimation, save Beren, who was off scouting. Beren would eventually become the first man to form a romantic partnership with an immortal elf. Through his love for Luthien Tinuviel, Beren completed the impossible task of recovering a Silmaril from Morgoth's crown, and with him would Finrod be slain by Sauron. Additionally, through this love of elf and man did they produce a son, Dior, whose daughter Elwing married Eärendil, leading to the famous brothers of Elrond and Elros. It is with Beren, along with Morwen and Rhiann, the wives of Húrin and Huor of the House Hador, that the House of Beor's bloodline would largely endure into future generations of heroes. House of Haleth. The second house of the Edain to reach Beleriand were those known as the folk of Haldad, or the Haladin, in First Age 312. The Haladin were shorter than the people of the House of Bëor, but resembled them in the darkness of their features. A much more reclusive and defensive bunch, these folk had not adapted as much to the elvish languages and customs. They were far more conservative and reluctant to take part in the events of the age, keeping their population smaller as well. Also dissimilar to the Beorians, the Haladin would halt their migration in the White Mountains, befriending the Druidain, a wild faction who would intermingle amongst the houses of Edain and otherwise fracture amongst the lands of Middle-earth. They did not make their journey further into Estolad, like the other houses, but dwelt in Thargelion, in the realm of Caranthir, a son of Feanor. The Haladin until now had not possessed a true leader, and were vulnerable to Morgoth's malice. In First Age 375, such an attack came from a host of orcs. This attack inspired Haldad to take on the role as leader and unite these people, fortifying their position in San Athrad, where the rivers of Gelion and Askar met in East Beleriand. He died in that battle, passing the lead then to his daughter, Haleth, the warrior queen. Halethand and Haladin would endure another week until Caranthir's forces came and suppressed the orcs. Impressed with her heroism, Caranthir offered Haleth fiefdom in his realm, but she declined. She and the Haladin travelled west, going up through Estolad, Nundungotheb, and finally Tarath Dirnen, before they were granted the forest of Brethil by King Thingol. They would claim this land on the condition that they defend the crossings of Teglin on the great tributary to Sirion. They would play little part in the War of the Noldor for a time. Haleth's grandson, Halmir, sired 4 children, 2 of which married into the House of Hador. One such union of Halmir's daughter Harith and Galdor of the House of Hador, producing the legendary brothers of Húrin and Huor. Their children and the tales that followed will be detailed more in the next section. The House of Haleth would be ended in the year First Age 500 amongst the chaotic events surrounding Húrin and his bloodline. There were some among the folk of Haleth, the name given to the greater people of Haleth and her father, who, along with the Druidain, would later on settle in Numenor. The House of Hador. The final house to reach Beleriand was the House of Hador. They were descendants of the greater folk, a broader classification of the groups of men who made up the first house. It began with a man named Malak, who would lead the first host of his people into Beleriand in First Age 313. They made their way to Estolad, where they remained longer than any other house. They were also larger in numbers than the previous pioneers. The Hildorians were proficient warriors, earning the fear and respect of the green elves of the local forests along the mountainside. They were tall folk, blonde-haired and blue-eyed, save those who were born of mixed houses later on. They would take on the darker features of the Beorians and the Haladin. They resembled the Vanyar, the elves who had largely remained in Middle-earth and could be mistaken for elves in their youth. They were passionate, fair, and noble. Malak's grandson, Magor, would eventually lead his people to Ered Wethrin, and there they would maintain a strong alliance with the elves of the House of Fingolfin, whose namesake ruled from Hithlum. In First Age 416, under the lordship of Hador, they were granted a fiefdom in Dor Lomin, where they prospered, thus birthing Hador's name as their house title. They learned from the Noldor and served with them in the wars of Beleriand. Fingolfin's son Fingon gifted the lords of the House of Hador with a dragon helm that they would bear for generations to come. Unfortunately, Hador would be slain alongside his son Gundor in the Dagor Bragolach, and his eldest son Galdor would take up his position. Galdor united his people with Beorians that fled Dorthonion, but he would marry the Haladin woman, Haleth, producing the two legendary sons, Hurin and Huor. The two brothers were sent away to Brethil and even spent time in Gondolin under Turgon's rule. Galdor died in First Age 462, leaving the lordship of his house to Hurin. Hurin and Huor would have sons of equal importance in the Tolkien Legendarium. Turin, born of Hurin, and Morwen of Bëor, and Tuor, born of Huor and Rion, also of Bëor. Hurin joined his folk to the Union of Maedhros, protecting their land of Dor Lomin, until the Nirneth Arnodiad, when much of their forces were sent to war on Morgoth in Angband. This event would prove to be devastating to the House of Hador. During Turgon's retreat back to Gondolin, the men held their ground in Rivil against Morgoth's forces that followed, all being slain in the process, including Huor, but not Hurin, who suffered a fate arguably more heinous than the rest of his men, cursed by Morgoth for refusing to reveal Turgon's secret city of Gondolin. This curse would plague their bloodline until the end of the world. After the battle, Hithlum was subjugated by evil men, called the Swarthy Men, who enslaved the people of Hador. Hurin's son, Turin, was the new lord of the House of Hador, but being so young was sent away to Doriath. He would grow up to become a great warrior, slaying the beast Glaurung, but still suffering from his father's curse, which would also cause much destruction to his family and others. His cousin Tuor would be sent to live with the Grey Elves in Mithrim. It was Tuor who would be elected by Ulmo to warn Targon of the fall of Gondolin, in part set in motion by Hurin later on. Tuor married Turgon's daughter, Idril, forming the second alliance of man and elf through matrimony, and it was they who produced Eärendil, the mariner. Eärendil, more so than any other man, represented the bloodline of all three of the houses of the Edain, and it was his offspring that would carry on, becoming Numenoreans, Dunedain.